As promised, this little video constitutes the second lecture in my series on Goethe. Yet before proceeding, I must rectify a miscalculation from the previous episode. 10 sessions were proposed initially, 12 talks will actually complete the cycle. My focus takes me to the moment when Goethe, still a young man, writes his play Götz of Berlichingen with the iron hand. A central question arises from the text. How does a soul remain free when the surrounding world solidifies into rigid law? The drama wrestles with the obvious concept of liberty. Individual autonomy strikes hard against the rising architecture of the modern state. Medieval honor bleeds into political pragmatism. Power seeks its own legitimacy through the tension between nature's dictate alongside positive decrees. History cracks open here, separating the chivalric world from a territory measured by calculation, clerks along with court intrigue. Goethe explores the desire for autonomous action along with the price exacted for remaining true to the bone. Old forms of community fracture, institutions reveal their treacherous flaws. I observe a tragic protagonist embodying a dying order. He falls beneath the wheels of an era speaking an alien language. Götz's prosthetic hand remains a tactile memory of a world governed by blood soil, alongside the sworn oath. Such cold metal serves as a physical manifestation of the artificial structures replacing organic human connection. Living flesh gives way to the machinery of a new epoch. Men adapt to the cold calculus of the court. Now I have a side question for those who listen to me. If you'd like to answer it, please leave a comment below. Which aspects of Goethe's struggle for freedom remain relevant today, and which have become obsolete? Has it really become obsolete? Or maybe it still works as a kind of dummy guide for all who strive to embrace the future without investing any effort or sacrifice in it. Think about that while I will carry on my lecture. What does the Gauntlet know about freedom? Before Goethe enters the mind, I place the iron hand before it. So metal arrives first and weight settles the argument in a shape thought receives under compulsion before intellect softens the edge into courtesy. Forged for war, then fixed to the stump of a living arm, the clenched instrument enters the room bearing a truth too severe for decorum, too palpable for aesthetic distance. The Gauntlet belongs to a man maimed in battle, who returned to action through iron. Yet it also passes into the imaginative possession of young writers, who felt art constricted by inherited form, pressed beneath French rulebook elegance, enclosed within the smooth tyranny of correctness governing polished entrances together with measured exits. Under that aspect, the iron device reaches far beyond Götz von Berlichingen himself, fastening upon the wrist of youthful Goethe and turning into an implement through which he assails the inherited stage, draws the horse into the salon, drives muscular vigor through cultivated speech, then opens a dramatic field charged with collision, insult, loyalty, appetite, grief, together with sudden reversals of human fortune. Through such metal, Goethe discovered a drama fit for rupture, a form whose vitality rose from impact, drawing authority from lived contact and carrying the abrasive mark of collision with the world. Within that artifact resides a double apprehension, and such doubleness grants the thing unusual interpretive density. Armor guards flesh, yet casing also stiffens the limb it encloses, so liberty under duress often appears in a guise that shelters even while it disciplines. Götz bears his prosthetic member as an emblem of agency regained after mutilation, whereas the Frankfurt prodigy adopts the same figure as the sign of a literary campaign directed against an inherited idiom shaped by symmetry, urbanity, regulation, together with luminous poise. In his case, youth desired heat, fracture, and a manner of utterance, entering with mud on the boot and foam at the horse's mouth, carrying smell together with urgency from the world beyond the salon into dramatic speech itself. Beneath antiquarian interest or picturesque insurgency lay the attraction drawing him toward the night, for in that iron-handed figure he found a means of imagining a theatre that could gallop, a playhouse whose motion arose when one energy struck another, and a diction prepared to bear action's burden in place of etiquette's polish. At that threshold, the Gauntlet ceases to serve as a prop, and assumes the gravity of a method through which form itself learns how to strike with consequence. Götz, und wenn ihr der Kaiser wärt, ihr müsstet mit dieser Vorlieb nehmen. Meine Rechte, obgleich im Kriege nicht unbrauchbar, ist gegen den Druck der Liebe unempfindlich. Sie ist eins mit ihrem Handschuh. Ihr seht, er ist Eisen. Martin, so sei der Götz von Berlichingen, ich danke dir, Gott, dass du mich ihn hast sehen lassen, diesen Mann, den die Fürsten hassen, und zu dem die Bedrängten sich wenden. Lasst mir diese Hand, lasst mich sie küssen. In English it reads, Götz, and if you were the emperor, you would have to be content with this one. My right hand, though not useless in war, feels nothing under the pressure of love. It is one with its gauntlet. You see, it is iron. Martin, so you are Götz von Berlichingen. I thank you, God, that you have let me see him, this man whom princes hate and to whom the oppressed turn. Let me have this hand, let me kiss it. Inside the title, Götz von Berlichingen mit der eisernen Hand, there gathers a peculiar intensity, for the hand stands forward from the outset, and does so with full necessity, almost as though the play announced in advance the substance through which its historical burden would become visible. The young dramatist understood that staged history required a material focus powerful enough to gather several valences into one visible thing, allowing injury, compensation, pride, combativeness, survival, together with the making of personal legend to remain active within a single hardened shape. From that dense nucleus the work receives its center of gravity, around which imperial conflict, knightly resentment, erotic calculation, legal entrapment, compromised loyalty, together with the conversion of fellowship into service, begin to whirl with mounting momentum. Across the board's movement multiplies, yet the gauntlet persists through such turbulence as the sign of a freedom at once splendid and damaged, regained through injury, exercised through resistance, marked at each turn by the hard substance that made its return possible. My question therefore gathers around that concentrated contradiction. Why did the youthful writer require violence of impulse, fracture and rebellion as the means through which he could break the literary decorum he inherited? Any response begins in revolt against style, although style by itself carries too little gravity for the burden at issue here. What the emerging author sought during those early years involved the rescue of vitality from inherited correctness together with the restoration of literary energy to experience under strain. He wanted more than a different manner of writing, for he wanted literature breathing through the chest again, striking the pulse with renewed intensity, moving through emotional extremity, recovering the dignity of excess whenever excess arose from living necessity. Götz enters letters like a rider breaking into a crowded inn-yard, and the scene establishes authority through palpable motion together with abrupt contact. The surrounding space answers with impact at every turn, while speech acquires the rhythm of lives exposed to hazard. Desire pushes against rank even while rank bears down upon desire, so the play opens among figures formed by danger, and language learns movement from their charged intercourse. That tavern beginning teaches the lesson at once, for the author enters through the saddle world and allows dramatic life to rise from contact tension, together with social friction. Such an opening owes a clear debt to Shakespeare's histories, above all to the tavern energy of Henry IV, Part 1 together with Henry IV, Part 2, where political destiny moves in close contact with appetite and improvised performance. So public consequence emerges from a scene of rough immediacy. Falstaff's sphere stands near at hand, though the German playwright pares away comic amplitude in favor of a sharper native edge that gives the scene a sterner temper. By that decision, the history play discovers an entrance outside the court, while the nation reveals itself through the material life of the road instead of ceremonial display. The young poet learned from Shakespeare that a people could first appear in the textures of ordinary encounter, and his gratitude later flared into the charged homage of Zum Shakespeare's Tag, where Shakespeare enters German literary consciousness as a liberator from rule-bound artifice. Before I move toward youth, one sentence from Shakespeare deserves fuller dwelling. In Julius Caesar, amid conspiracy, public rhetoric, private ambition, civic theatre, together with mortal decision, Cassius says of Caesar, he doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus. The line exerts authority here through scale, for Shakespearean drama enlarges the human figure until the person assumes the dimensions of political weather. That magnitude fired Goethe's imagination, drawing him toward figures who overflowed polite containment and whose speech carried consequence through the whole room. He sought history understood as collision among temperaments, as one formed will exerting itself upon another. So Götz, Vaisling in Adelheid, together with Maria enter charged with energies that bend structure through the sheer weight of disposition. The historical drama accomplishes more than imitation of Shakespeare, for it provincialises empire, tests law against personality, and asks whether freedom can live under institutions already formed by the grammar of enclosure. Under that burden, the gauntlet carries a dark knowledge, for liberty, when figured through the solitary heroic will, already advances toward defeat within the very image of its power. Iron strikes, yet the same metal also closes, so a hand refitted in steel bears compensation together with wound within a single shape. From the gauntlet, my argument passes to the young writer who recognized in that hard instrument an image of his own struggle, for the tension lodged within the object returns with equal intensity in the conditions that formed his imagination. Frankfurt gave Goethe order before it gave him revolt, and that sequence carries interpretive weight. A patrician household, secure civic standing, paternal discipline, together with a substantial education, formed Johann Wolfgang Goethe within a world carrying cultivated legitimacy into every room. His father embodied arrangement and exactitude, presenting life under the sign of structure together with formal command, while his mother brought a livelier warmth that opened speech toward anecdote, verbal freedom, together with imaginative play. The household therefore held a tension that later returned within his art, where authority meets spontaneity and cultivated measure confronts the unruly claims of life. Any lecture on Götz begins there, for Sturm enters with greatest intensity, where accumulated tension has already gathered, and where order has already trained the nerves to feel constraint. The boy read voraciously, and early formation joined cultural abundance to a sharpening impatience towards settled arrangements of inherited expression. Puppet theatre gave him dramatic movement in miniature, biblical grandeur opened a language of elevation, and rhetorical training taught the dignity of public style. Yet a mind formed amid such richness can experience that same abundance as constriction, when the whole furniture of culture appears placed in advance by earlier hands, and when each gesture of expression seems to arrive within an already ordered room. Youth carries that impatience with unusual keenness. He wanted a literature one could inhabit through the whole pulse and through the mortal hurry of being alive. So early poetry begins to register a desire for forms equal to felt life in motion. Take Willkommen und Abschied. Its opening charge remains one of the finest entrances in Goethe. Es schlug mein Herz, geschwind zu Pferde. Es war getan fast gedacht. My heart beat, quick to horse. The deed stood almost finished before thought had fully gathered itself. Speed governs the lyric from the outset, where heartbeat passes into riding and emotion presses ahead of mediation. Reflection enters only after action has already taken hold, so the love poem begins under the sign of motion, urgency, together with a landscape crossed at haste. The rider occupies no chamber of measured contemplation in which feeling receives careful inspection. He mounts, he travels, and the line itself lands with the beat of hoofs. One preparation for Götz already appears there, for the horse becomes an anti-salon instrument, a vehicle of immediacy, the means through which the self discovers truth in movement. Lös. Freiheit, Freiheit, das sind schlechte Menschen, unschlüssige, bedächtige Esel. Ihr sollt abziehen, mit Gewehr, Pferden und Rüstung. Götz, wie steht's? Georg, Sie sind gesattelt. Götz, du bist fix. Georg, wie der Vogel aus dem Käfig. In my own English rendering of Goethe. Lös, freedom, freedom. They are wretched people, irresolute, overcautious asses. You are to ride out, with weapons, horses, and armour. Götz, how do things stand? Georg, they are saddled. Götz, you are quick. Georg, like a bird out of the cage. A related liberation appears in my lead, though the register there turns from urgency toward ecstatic seasonal expansion. Wie herrlich leuchtet mir die Natur. How gloriously nature shines toward me. The lyric radiates plenitude, yet beneath that joyous lift I hear another insurrection against inherited stiffness. The world pours itself toward the speaker, vitality enters from every quarter, and the self expands in answer to that incoming impulse. Feeling reaches outward until the poem seems to grow under the same generative vitality, animating spring itself, while form, though present throughout, strains into song under the abundance it carries. The youthful poet already sought a language equal to experience when experience arrived charged beyond moderation. He wanted lyric to occur as an event carrying the immediacy of life before consciousness had cooled it into arrangement. The Strasbourg years intensified that turn. Goethe's move there in 1770 marks one of those decisive passages in which education becomes conversion. Strasbourg gave him distance from Frankfurt, and with that distance came a fresh relation to place, to inheritance, together with the future shape of his art. The cathedral stood before him as a living argument in stone, Alsatian mixture loosened the boundaries of cultural habit, and Herder entered as the figure who brought intellectual ignition to a sensibility already prepared for combustion. The scale of that encounter reshapes the whole account of formation. Johann Gottfried Herder arrived as a critical provocation, whose adversarial friendship pressed upon Goethe with an intelligence already enlarged by historical reach together with anthropological breadth beyond the limits of earlier training. Through Herder's influence, Artificial taste lost prestige, inherited classicism yielded authority, and older poetry came forward with renewed vitality through a vision of living speech joined to form growing out of collective life. He drew the younger man toward a deeper encounter with origins, vernacular power, Gothic vigor, above all Shakespeare, so Strasbourg became the scene of a second education whose severity opened a richer future than the first. Within Dicht und Wahrheit, Goethe recalls that awakening through a retrospective gratitude charged with intellectual astonishment. Herder offered little consolation, for his companionship drove Goethe into crisis, while also giving that ordeal a disciplined shape through which bewilderment passed into understanding. Under such strain, the polished conventions admired across cultivated Europe began to appear estranged from the native energies of existence, whereas Shakespeare stood forth as living evidence that drama might unfold with organic amplitude, enlarging itself through branching movement while sustaining aristocratic elevation together with common appetite within one vital action. Dramatic succession could therefore advance with an elasticity freed from fear, allowing courtly display to yield before tavern speech while public conflict pressed upon intimate enclosure until the entire social body entered the stage with a legitimacy newly felt. What rule-bound criticism had dismissed as looseness then disclosed itself as a truer fidelity to experience in its fullness. Strasbourg likewise drew Goethe into experiences whose emotional and sensory intensity deepened his relation to the ground beneath his feet and to the inhabited world closing around him from every quarter. Place entered his imagination with a denser claim, so reading ceased to serve as the sole avenue toward new form. He was now walking into form, receiving its demands through the grain together with the stress of lived surroundings. The cathedral acted upon him with singular power, for Gothic ascent revealed stones subjected to vertical strain while communal labor, gathered across generations, rose into visible mass. In the famous essay on German architecture, his praise of Strasbourg Cathedral already reveals a preference for disciplined vigor over polished smoothness, and from that perception arises a sense of monumentality grounded in striving animation, textured severity, together with living asymmetry. That lesson passes directly into Götz. Then Shakespeare entered and altered the scale of possibility itself. Zum's Shakespeare's Tag remains a manifesto of youthful literary insurgency, and within it I hear a voice almost intoxicated by emancipation. Goethe greets Shakespeare with the ardor reserved for a liberator at the gate, receiving from him a sanction for amplitude in character, movement, and dramatic life. One cry gathers the temper entire, with its invocation of nature as the ground upon which Shakespeare's persons stand before the imagination in their full human amplitude. That exclamation draws strength from reiterated fervor, joined to the conviction that art had strayed from the living grain of existence, and recovered that grain through this encounter. Those figures move with the breadth of life itself, carrying contrary impulses within a single dramatic presence, and extending beyond the thin limits of exemplary design. Each one possesses felt density and bears a divided truth. Such recognition prepared Götz through several permissions of unusual depth. Multiplicity now possessed warrant, dramatic structure accepted expansion across changing locations, inherited decorum yielded before a rougher historical texture. Native remembrance also acquired fresh legitimacy, enabling an earlier German world to furnish substance under greater strain than imported exemplars had supplied. Along that transformation came renewed confidence in vehemence as a criterion of artistic truth, whereby heat entered composition as value and emotional amplitude assumed the dignity of knowledge. Another formative image deserves notice here. Amid his developing relation to that English dramatist, the young Frankfurt writer enacted the receptive motion often performed by strong readers at the instant of awakening. He received a foreign master as living companionship. The encounter arrived more as animating presence than as authorship, and such visitation seldom leaves artistic shape untouched. With that encounter, inherited conventions begin to resemble lifeless furnishings, from which sensation gives rise to a craving for air, movement, and the violent grace of an overturned table. Goethe's youthful effective register already inclines into Sturm und Drang through a mode of lyric utterance that grants emotion a rapid, enlarging, almost invasive life within the poem. Love enters with urgency. Longing expands perception until feeling strains against ordinary proportion. Exaltation passes into leave-taking with a sharpness that gives departure the heat of revelation, while return revives desire in a fresh surge that moves through nerve and blood with the passing immediacy of weather. Critical reflection gains real purchase once this restlessness receives recognition as a claim of legitimacy grounded in lived existence. For the adolescent writer came to treat immediate life as bearing an authority older than social decorum and more compelling than inherited etiquette. Under that conviction, feeling acquired sanction as a valid form of apprehension, genius appeared as a condition worthy of assent, originating vitality assumed the weight of truth, and nature stood forth as a source of warrant. Experience itself, a term criticism often thins into pale abstraction, pressed for utterance equal to its violence, and demanded language commensurate with the intensity through which it became known. Elsewhere, horseflesh governs the imaginative field by giving motion a visible shape in movement, pace, and territorial extension. In Willkommen und Abschied, mounted urgency acquires palpable contour through the rider's passage across distance. Within Götz, equestrian presence enlarges the inhabited world by placing travel, command, and martial readiness inside the very grain of dramatic action. The scene therefore draws its propulsion from the material conditions of riding, so that tack, road, messenger, sudden leave-taking, and readiness for conflict enter the writing as constitutive elements of its motion instead of decorative accompaniment. What emerges from that configuration exceeds rebellion as declared subject, for composition itself begins to move in a rebellious manner. Settings alter with unusual speed, speech gathers momentum, action drives forward through abrupt transitions, and the script rejects the settled composure associated with chamberly cadence. A writer's discipline thus comes to govern the page, where an earlier poise had once held authority. A further contrast enters the scene at this point. Goethe's formative years received French classicism under the signs of pedagogic prestige, established criticism, and continental taste, while the same inheritance carried the stamp of German disunity, divided polities, uneven letters, and a culture engaged in the difficult labor of self-confirmation. That doubleness bears directly upon the question at hand, for a young German author seeking greatness during the 1770s faced a strained alternative between forms allured by refinement and another path that located native strength within harsher historical substance, vernacular utterance, Gothic survival, and the amplitude learned from Shakespeare. Goethe elected vigor in place of polish. He embraced a rough liberty that carried greater risk than sanctioned elegance, and through that decision the iron gauntlet began to glitter with a newly emblematic brightness. What later received the name Sturm und Drang pursued liberation through charged vitality, though the term acquires real precision only when the movement appears as an effort to relocate literary authority itself, granting genius a sanction that no inherited rule could contain, allowing effective urgency to press beyond decorous restraint, and admitting a mode of artistic presence in which immediacy, breadth, national self-assertion, and contradiction entered the work as conditions of life instead of faults awaiting correction. Rebellion already sounds within the title, for its paired words convert verbal art into an atmospheric disturbance and make literature seem subject to storm, impact, violence, and propulsion. An age trained to admire lucid proportion thus encountered a younger generation drawn to lightning with a fascination that carried both danger and desire. The inherited order presented itself through more than one cultural aspect. French drama, most visibly in its admired classical forms, offered a tightly composed aesthetic whose value lay in unity, elegance, rhetorical finish, lucid design, noble containment, and a disciplined command over artistic means. Young Goethe understood the magnitude of those achievements and recognized their prestige. For the insurgent cohort, however, that same inheritance imposed a long-standing constraint, prescribing the terms upon which serious art might proceed and passing passion through conventions that had grown remote from the rough texture of lived experience. Its governing assumptions admitted little space for mixed tonalities, abrupt transitions, grotesque figures, excess, social plurality, or the historical sprawl through which actual life presses upon representation. What emerged from such discipline resembled art conducted under vigilant supervision, its composure sustained by external command more than by native necessity. In that charged setting, Sturm und Drang sought an art exposed to risk, volatility, and the full intensity of life. Herder's intervention proved decisive at this juncture. In Von Deutscher Art und Kunst, had the case for native strength joined historical consciousness to a living inheritance carried in popular tradition, while the dignity granted to forms that grow from their own conditions of life gave the younger writers a vocabulary through which resistance could acquire intellectual shape. Shakespeare entered that argument as exemplary presence precisely through an achievement that exceeded neoclassical reduction and showed how creation might arise from life in all its amplitude, granting a people recognizable form within the work itself. Such claims readily expanded into grandiosity, and the period produced that expansion in abundance, yet their historical efficacy remains unmistakable, for a young German literature received authorization to place itself at hazard, and to discover its stature through the act of that exposure. At that moment Goethe produced two major companion works of insurgent subjectivity, Götz von Berlichingen and The Sorrows of Young Werther. I call them companion works because each gives revolt a distinct formal habitation and binds that revolt to a separate human end. Werther draws the storm into the life of feeling, where desire, thwarted social placement, impossible attachment, and an absolute emotional pitch combine until sensibility itself becomes the site of ruin. Götz gives the same turbulent energy an outward field of action, placing conflict within political arrangement, feudal allegiance, imperial governance, knightly independence, juridical constraint, and acts of violence that arise from those conditions. A single generation speaks through both texts, although it speaks in sharply different registers. In Werther, the self confronts a world experienced as unendurable. In Götz, heroic personality meets institutions that close upon it with suffocating constraint. One figure perishes in the consuming heat of grief, while the other reaches death through collision with public order. Taken together, the two works disclose the shape of an age with unusual clarity. The rebellion also carried a distinctly national edge. German literary culture, dispersed across courts and cities, possessed neither the consolidated prestige nor the centralized authority that attached to French models. So Shakespeare offered the younger writers more than a dramatic example. Through him they perceived a path around French command, and discovered the possibility of greatness unbought by imitation. His presence authorized an image of literary stature grounded in depth of vision, amplitude of form, popular energy, historical reach, and emotional range. Hence Goethe's celebration of Shakespeare carries the fervor of deliverance, for the English dramatist gave him leave to create a German historical drama whose looseness announced independence in the very shape of its art. The contrast appears with particular clarity in Shakespeare's histories themselves. Across Henry IV, Part I and Part II, the nation enters view as a layered and moving whole, for tavern wit stands near princely formation, rebellion presses upon the business of rule, military urgency sharpens paternal authority, comic self-display accompanies political performance, and each register modifies the others until the realm acquires breadth, motion, and social depth within a single dramatic field. Life arrives from several directions at once, each bearing its own claim upon the stage. Through such movement the prince learns by passing between worlds, adjusting himself within transition, and discovering his future office through experience that changes its shape as he enters it. Falstaff, for all the splendor of his verbal abundance and the corruption carried within his charm, becomes a grotesque instructor in the theatre of statecraft. That dramaturgy delighted the young Goethe, for it admitted the mixed substance of society onto the stage, and allowed history to appear as collision, transition, and unstable relation, with polished tableau yielding to a more living dramatic order. From Hamlet and King Lear a further education followed. Hamlet showed that dramatic action could bear philosophical weight while retaining theatrical electricity, and King Lear showed that the greatest amplitude of suffering, joined to social disintegration, could take form through rupture, tonal violence, visionary extremity, and the storm understood as a principle of dramatic organization. In such plays, fracture itself becomes a vehicle of revelation, and truth enters with greater severity through broken form than through smooth composure. Youthful Goethe absorbed that lesson deeply. Götz does not reproduce the tragic architecture of Lear. It carries, however, a cognate conviction that brokenness on the stage may convey a fidelity surpassing the calm finish of polished decorum. The anti-French polemic also calls for careful understanding, for its center lies in a struggle over artistic legitimacy conducted within the literary culture of the age. At issue stood a generation's sense that rules derived from admired models had stiffened into an authority hostile to immediacy and had begun to govern writing with the severity of a disciplinary code. From that dissatisfaction arose the desire for a literature generated by the urgencies of lived experience, together with a wish that the singular power of the creator should receive full recognition. Under those conditions, the word genius burns through the period with dangerous intensity, naming an originating source, a native capacity, an originality irreducible to imitation, and a mode of form that emerges from necessity proper to the act of creation, instead of obedience to external prescription. Every claim of that kind approaches self-idolatry, yet during the 1770s the same claim also opened German letters into a newly liberated field. Goethe's Götz gave that liberation dramatic embodiment through a figure drawn from the early 16th century, a knight whose historical existence had already gathered legendary contour. The choice itself reveals the aspiration of the period. For a German knight, imperial conflict, feud, mounted action, local allegiance, armed autonomy, and legal contest offered Goethe material through which he could dramatize a world antecedent to modern domestication, a world in which personality enters direct and violent contest with authority. Historical distance thus entered the service of the present, and feudal Germany became a mirror through which the young author struck against the assumptions of his own literary century. A companion glance toward Werther sharpens the comparison. That novel, shaped through letters and carried by emotional overflow, fluctuating self-scrutiny, rapture before nature and anguish before social form, made subjectivity itself insurgent by granting the speaking self a claim that exceeded social utility and sought a language adequate to the amplitude of its feeling. Werther reads as a soul that resists reduction to usefulness within the codes that surround him, and the intensity of that resistance gives his suffering the aspect of singular destiny. The work became generational through the recognition many readers found there of the conflict between expansive feeling and a contracted social order. Götz offers the same conflict in a harder costume, for the heroic self meets institutional enclosure through visible defiance. The difference lies in the mode of response, as Werther collapses into grief while Götz answers with a stroke. At this point an objection enters. Does Sturm und Drang glorify violence too readily? In part, yes. The movement often confers value on intensity through the vivid life it seems to carry. Under that disposition, vehemence readily takes on the aspect of truth. Rebellion begins to seem sufficient to itself. Emotional excess acquires the standing of moral authority. Goethe's youth shared in that temptation. Götz matters in part through the way it reveals both the splendor and the cost of such investment. Young authors who discover a liberating master often become polemical through gratitude. The tone of Shakespeare's tag bears that mark. Goethe writes like a man whose windows have been thrown open after long confinement. Such moments produce manifestos. They also bring exaggerations. Yet exaggeration belongs to generative revolt. A century does not loosen its grip because someone requests moderation. It loosens when another style of conviction enters the room with enough heat to alter prestige. Thus Götz appears as both artwork and act of cultural insurgency. Its dramatic looseness, its abrupt scene changes, its historical roughness, its mixture of private and public urgency, its vigorous speech, mounted energy, suspicion of legal and courtly enclosures, all these enact a literary politics. Goethe is not merely telling a story about rebellion. He is writing rebelliously against inherited decorum. The Gauntlet now begins to gather a second meaning. At first it figured personal survival after mutilation. Here it becomes generational armor. The young writer straps on iron in order to strike the stage that formed him. The answer to the question of form begins in structure. Götz refuses the compact dignity of neoclassical arrangement. The drama moves with abrupt energy, cuts across its material, and shifts locality with a bold impatience that keeps composure under strain. Within a single frame, repose yields to restless passage through tavern life, mounted movement, castle space, imperial setting, domestic interior, and prison confinement, so that the play lives by sequence and unsettled poise alike. Such fragmentation arose from conviction, though contemporaries often heard another cause in it. History appears there in broken contact zones, with messages arriving half-spent, plans suffering interruption, reversals altering direction, departures coming suddenly, and alliances changing the ground beneath every action. The play thinks through discontinuity. The opening in scenes announce that decision with remarkable confidence. Entry comes by way of an inn-world animated by riders, thick with drink, populated by servants, and governed by rough exchange, with imperial abstraction held at a distance from the threshold. The social field therefore lies open from the first moment. News travels in bodies along the road and enters with each arrival. Such an opening teaches the audience to read history from below and at an angle. We approach power by way of those who feel its strain in movement. That choice owes much to Shakespearean practice, above all to the history plays where statecraft ripens amid appetite, turns comic and hardens toward martial action. Yet Goethe's adaptation bears its own quality. The German road enters the stage with a shorter temper. Speech carries an edge, and the horse remains almost audible beneath it. A drama built on collision needs characters who embody distinct vectors of energy. Götz himself arrives as knightly independence personified, proud, loyal to his own code, resistant to centralized power, rooted in personal honor, capable alike of tenderness and violence, drawn toward action with a readiness that exceeds calculation. His iron hand literalises the character, for it presents a man broken and refitted, a figure who bears history in the flesh. Admiration readily follows. Danger also gathers around his self-conception. He belongs to an older order whose virtues already carry doom within them. Waislingen forms the essential counterpoint. Götz stands for the relative integrity of a personal code. Waislingen moves toward courtly service, compromise, ambition, accommodation, and the seduction exercised by proximity to power. His relation to Götz carries tragic weight, for friendship survives within political divergence. Goethe understands that rebellion intensifies when betrayal arrives through former intimacy. A pure enemy offers insufficient complexity. Waislingen carries weight here because he knows Götz has loved him in some fashion, and yet enters another orbit. Court favor, erotic attraction, and the promise of advancement draw him away. Through Waislingen, the play shows how institutions absorb individuals through desire as an active lure. Adelheid deepens the argument still further. Her presence brings erotic calculation and political design into the drama with a volatile brilliance that alters the temperature of every scene she enters. Through her, appetite acquires strategic shape, for she reads weakness with precision, bends circumstance toward advantage, and unsettles masculine codes of honor through a more fluid command of persons and situations. Some readers cast her as a femme fatale. That reading remains narrow. Adelheid belongs to the work's larger claim about power in a world where rank enters desire, legality serves advancement, and self-interest learns to move through established forms with practiced intelligence. She knows how structures operate, and she uses that knowledge with unnerving skill. Such scenes pulse with danger through the superior intelligence of her movement, beside knightly men held fast by older scripts. Maria gathers a different register. Against Adelheid's volatile intelligence, she brings fidelity, domestic gravity, and an effective center through which the humane claim of the household enters a field usually governed by heroic action. Her relation to Götz reveals the cost carried by his world, for a heroic code may shine on horseback while leaving a long shadow across the home. A calmer moral claim enters the play through Maria, and that calm carries composure joined to steadfast strength. From her position, Goethe admits the household into the politics of rebellion, and shows that freedom carries consequences within domestic life as surely as it does in the field of public action. The imperial scenes widen the drama beyond local quarrel. Empire appears as a distant, compromised, often suspect authority, entangled with legal procedure, factional interest, and administrative reach. Goethe's historical sense appears in the stern balance with which he renders each side historically implicated, so that Götz stands against imperial encroachment while the knightly world he represents belongs, as well, to a fragmenting and violent order. Law, for all its coercive reach, enters history as an effort to gather feud into a more stable form. Depth enters the play through its presentation of righteousness as divided among contending and imperfect orders, each carrying its own claim, its own damage, and its own historical burden. At this stage the famous line enters with full necessity. Confined, harried, and provoked into contempt, Götz sends his answer to the emperor's representative. Aber sag's ihm, kann mich im Arsche lecken. The sentence stands as one of the great detonations in German literary history, and its enduring power reaches far beyond obscenity alone. Through that utterance decorous expectation shatters, flesh enters the political stage, imperial majesty contracts into an image of contempt, and heroic selfhood chooses insult as its mode of defiance. A literature trained in refinement suddenly hears the backside address empire in its own coarse register. That shock carried real consequence. In diction alone, the sentence enacted Sturm und Drang. Götz, mich ergeben auf Gnad und Ungnad. Mit wem redet ihr, bin ich ein Räuber? Sag deinem Hauptmann, vor ihro kaiserliche Majestät hab ich, wie immer, schuldigen Respekt. Aber sag's ihm, kann mich. In Shakespeare tongue it goes, Götz, surrender myself. Come what may. Who do you think you're talking to? Am I a robber? Tell your captain I have, as always, the utmost respect for his imperial majesty. But tell him he can, I won't say what is it that he asked to be kissed. It is enough I cited Goethe's foul language once above. Rhythm carries its own authority. The phrase advances with blunt propulsion, then descends toward corporeal insult with a carefully staged climax. The imperative sags eam, joined to the measured pause before the obscenity arrives, gives the line its theatrical vitality. One hears, in that timing, something like the ceremonial strike of a gauntlet upon a table. A generation kept it in memory, for it voiced openly what polite literature, through long discipline and cultivated restraint, had taught itself to cast beyond the threshold of utterance. Fragmentation in Götz also becomes an instrument of historical movement. The scenes resist any settled condition of exhaustive exposition, and the drama proceeds through collision, encounter, and consequence as events unfold across shifting locations. A reader repeatedly senses that life continues beyond the visible stage between one appearance and the next, so that the play acquires an amplitude extending past its immediate frame. Such a method stands closer to the architecture of Shakespearean history plays than to the tightened unity of classical concentration. Richard III offers the clearest comparison, where rapid transitions among public performance, private plotting, report, seduction, maneuver, ceremonial display, and corporeal urgency generate a world seized by political acceleration. Goethe learned from that theatre that history on the stage may emerge through montage, through the accumulated sequence of clash and transition. The prison scenes bring the drama to its most severe contraction. Freedom, earlier bound to mounted movement and the openness of the field, passes into enclosure. The knight of the road becomes the captive of institutions. Yet imprisonment also grants Götz a tragic enlargement, for it clarifies the meaning of his liberty while exposing the limits that had always inhabited it. A heroic self shaped for action undergoes acute suffering in confinement, for action had furnished the very ground of its being. Here the iron hand acquires an almost intolerable irony. That prosthetic sign of agency accompanies the captive frame into helplessness. Metal endures whereas liberty attenuates. A formal point deserves emphasis. The play's looseness permits collisions among registers that tighter classicist drama would have filtered apart, so martial roughness occupies the same dramatic space as emotional tenderness. Political negotiation enters scenes shaped by intimate speech, humor glints at the edge of danger, female agency unsettles male codes, reported action lends thickness to the surrounding world, and minor figures carry atmospheric truth. Such a form may appear baggy to readers who seek hard symmetry, yet Goethe pursued living amplitude. He conceived historical drama as a field of active relations instead of a finished sculpture. Another feature emerges in the language's varied textures. Goethe's speech often cuts with directness. Courtly and strategic voices proceed through different verbal habits. Scenes of feeling either soften or tighten in response to relation and risk. Goethe had yet to become the later classicist associated with chiseled balance that in completion serves the play. The language behaves as though it carries a taxing dramatic charge. Syntax drives the action forward. The reader senses a young writer extending German toward a wider theatrical capacity. Shakespeare's Henry IV plays provide an especially fruitful counterpoint here. Prince Hal moves between worlds and learns through transition. Falstaff, Hotspur, the King, the Tavern Company, and the rebels each contribute a distinct register that enriches the national drama. Goethe adopts a comparable principle of plural social energy, though his own play works on a smaller comic scale than Shakespeare's. Hotspur offers the sharper parallel for Götz. Each figure binds martial pride to impatience with political subtlety. Honor governs each man as an animating fixation. Magnificence in both cases carries its own fatal limit, yet Götz acquires a different historical contour through his placement, for Hotspur stands within a monarchy moving toward consolidation, whereas Götz inhabits a more fractured imperial order in which knightly independence already faces supersession. That distinction grants Goethe's hero elegiac power. A comparison with Richard III discloses Goethe's originality with greater exactness, since Richard perfects theatrical self-presentation within the shifting formations of emergent state politics, whereas Götz occupies a contrasting dramatic economy in which theatricality yields to a more immediate cast of presence, a less performative relation to circumstance, and a temper more readily drawn toward deed than toward manipulation. Yet the drama, through its own representational logic, converts him into spectacle even as it appears to honor directness, For the iron hand confers upon him the force of an image, that image hardens into legend, and legend becomes the medium through which historical personality reaches posterity as emblem. Goethe grasped that process with unusual clarity, and the Gauntlet once more gathers and directs the field of significance. Adelheide's place in the play invites a more sustained pause, since the young Goethe endows her with a dangerous radiance precisely because collision requires figures capable of moving within power's subtler circuits, where calculation surpasses the blunt energy through which knights announce themselves, where entanglement proves more decisive than vows, and where intelligence meets the loud ceremonials of male honor with a superior strategic fluency. Through that shaping force she enters the drama as one of its anti-idyllic agents, for history emerges here through no purified ground upon which noble masculinity alone can determine events, but through a scene in which desire carries political consequence, seduction reorders allegiance, and the chamber exerts decisive force upon the battlefield. The play's heroic unruliness emerges on several planes, although its force becomes legible only when one sees how subject, diction, form, social range, and the rejection of decorous purification converge within a single dramatic logic, whose governing conviction holds that historical truth enters art in broken contours, uneven surfaces, and abrupt transitions. Goethe therefore discovered in historical drama a language of collision through a procedure that allowed the drama itself to strike against inherited norms of theatrical beauty, so that formal disturbance became the very medium through which historical experience acquired speech. At this juncture, the horse returns, and the reason for its centrality, which I identified earlier through the figure of the saddle world, now stands fully revealed. Mounted life signifies a mode of existence shaped by mobility before bureaucracy, honor before administration, immediate relation to territory, risk endured through the living frame, and time apprehended through journey and encounter instead of procedural delay. Within that order, Götz takes his place. The animal therefore serves as freedom's creaturely extension, even as it marks a historical boundary, since a rider may outpace a messenger while remaining unequal to the duration of a transformed political order. The play understands this condition with complete clarity, and its sadness deepens through that recognition. A youthful answer to the question of freedom would propose freedom as forceful selfhood meeting external constraint with active refusal. The play offers abundant material for such an interpretation. Götz appears tall, injured yet unbent, faithful to his code, contemptuous toward corrupt authority, and decisive at precisely those moments when others draw back from action. A generation hungry for greatness would have found him immediately compelling. Yet the drama yields a sterner answer through the movement of its action. Freedom emerges here as a tragic intensity situated between obsolete forms of life and emergent structures of rule. Its radiance commands attention, yet that radiance belongs to a mode of being whose splendor exceeds its capacity to shape the coming order. That conflict grants Götz philosophical depth. Law enters the play under the sign of ambiguity. From one vantage, law appears as an encroaching apparatus, an administrative and imperial power that seeks to bind local autonomy, punish self-help, domesticate armed honor, and gather scattered powers into a more central order. Viewed from another angle, law assumes the character of historical necessity, carrying society away from feud, arbitrary violence, private war, and the unstable dispensation of justice delivered through stronger hands. Götz resists law, for the legal order advancing toward him bears the marks of domination. Yet the world he defends bears those same marks in another historical form. Freedom in the play therefore resists identification with pure moral good. What the drama presents instead is a contested mode of life, one whose grandeur, cost, and historical finitude remain inseparable. Rank complicates the question further, since Götz esteems loyalty, friendship, martial honor, and noble independence within a social order whose very structure assigns liberty unequally and secures privilege for the knight above peasants, servants, and dependents. Admiration for his resistance therefore remains possible at the same moment that one recognizes how little such defiance offers by way of general liberation. Goethe's youth, captivated by energetic personality, did not always bring that problem into full interpretive focus, though subsequent history would place it at the center of judgment. The play acquires greater gravity when approached through this contradiction, for heroic freedom may coexist with social narrowness, and a proud individual may oppose central authority even while giving living form to another hierarchy. Personality then emerges as the decisive battleground, for Sturm und Drang elevated it almost to sacred status by granting genius, feeling, original force, and authenticity of impulse and exceptional authority. Götz reveals corruption through contrast and rejects abasement through conduct as much as declaration. Yet any polity founded wholly upon powerful individuals moves towards ceaseless contest, since institutions may deform existence even as they furnish the terms by which coexistence becomes durable. The drama neither resolves that tension nor disguises its force, and precisely through that sustained irresolution it retains its intellectual and tragic power. At this point, a later Goethean comparison yields genuine interpretive value. Egmont returns to the problem of political freedom through a second charismatic protagonist. Yet Egmont stands within a later moment of Goethe's development, one that brings firmer compositional balance, sharper awareness of political emblem, and a more meditative engagement with freedom as it moves beneath the hand of state authority. In Götz, by contrast, the vital motion of the drama comes forward in a more immediate condition, less filtered through mature conceptual ordering and more fully carried by impact, encounter, and dramatic shock. There the central question emerges through collision before reflective doctrine has gathered complete form around it. Such immediacy gives the play a distinctive authority, for the young Goethe conducts his historical inquiry through the whole dramatic organism, allowing action, temperament, and conflict to think in common. A brief turn toward imperial and knightly historical material brings the stakes into clearer view. Within the 16th century empire, distributed sovereignties existed beside local rights, noble privilege, martial traditions of aristocratic independence, ascending territorial rule, juridical change, fiscal exaction, and an enlarging central will. The historical Götz belonged to precisely that transitional order. Goethe takes hold of him at the instant when an older conception of freedom appears in its splendor, even as history begins to transfer its energy into other forms of power. That choice often grips young writers, for it gives outward shape to a deeply felt psychic truth. The author also inhabits a threshold. Inherited forms close more tightly around his desire for a life of less governed vitality. Thus the knight assumes the shape of an allegory for literary rebellion. Yet the play's wisdom emerges through its willingness to let defeat articulate its own authority. Götz founds no renewed civic settlement and inaugurates no stable dispensation. He endures instead as a tragic remnant whose continued presence gives the drama its gravest insight. Freedom therefore appears here less as a lasting civic achievement than as an act of witness, a shaped gesture, a deliberate stance assumed beneath adverse history. Götz, schließt eure Herzen sorgfältiger als eure Tore. Es kommen die Zeiten des Betrugs, es ist ihm Freiheit gegeben. Die Nichtswürdigen werden regieren mit List, und der Edle wird in ihre Netze fallen. Gebt mir einen Trunk Wasser. Himmlisch Luft, Freiheit, Freiheit. In English, Götz, bar your hearts more carefully than your gates. The times of deceit are coming, and freedom has been given to it. The unworthy will rule by cunning, and the noble man will fall into their nets. Ye give me a draught of water. Heavenly air, freedom, freedom. In that light, the iron hand acquires a mournful dignity, for it marks agency recovered at the very moment when that recovered agency serves a world already passing into eclipse. Heroic action retains its splendor within such a vision, yet historical time may carry that splendor away, leaving courage intact while victory passes elsewhere. That conception draws me toward Julius Caesar. Shakespeare's Roman play returns again and again to the question of what public liberty can mean once commanding personalities begin to overshadow republican institutions. Brutus moves in the name of liberty, or at least under that conviction. Antony works through the full seductions of rhetoric. Caesar already occupies the civic horizon with a singularity so expansive that the common forms of the republic begin to crack beneath it. Civil ruin follows. Goethe learned from Shakespeare that liberty and greatness share no natural harmony. Powerful figures may place themselves in freedom's defense, yet the same commanding temper may also consume the civic conditions through which freedom lives. Götz receives that inheritance in another register. The knight resists incorporation, though his own way of life arises from a violent order within which public peace remains fragile. A moral judgment on Goethe belongs here, for admiration by itself would smooth the grain of the work into something too uniform for the drama it actually sustains. In the youthful Goethe's search for release from decorum, I find moments in which insurgent vitality receives an authority larger than the action can securely bear. He places deep trust in intensity as a mode of human revelation, then clothes rebellious ardor in a splendor that grants it dangerous prestige. Such imaginative investment yielded magnificent art yet the same act of elevation also casts aristocratic violence in an alluring light by surrounding it with the aura of authenticity. That hazard deserves sustained attention. Part of the greatness of Götz arises from the way the drama grows beyond its own early temptation, for the movement of the play gradually discloses that heroic will, however stirring in immediate effect, cannot heal the fracture between singular personality and the claims of order. What, then, does self-rule mean within the drama? I would answer that freedom emerges here as a lived discipline of the self under historical conditions that seek to narrow the human figure into something smaller, more serviceable, more easily mastered. At one moment it takes shape in speech that preserves dignity before humiliation can secure a foothold. At another it resides in a fidelity held fast even when seduction clothes surrender in attractive colors. Elsewhere it enters action formed by honor, where conduct receives its measure from an inner code more exacting than calculation. The play also grants this condition a tragic lucidity, for it knows that such mastery of the self may remain misaligned with the political future that advances around it. In Götz, freedom reaches its brightest radiance at the very moment when history strips it of worldly tenure, and that conjunction gives the drama its enduring severity. That is why the prison scenes wound with such enduring depth. Enclosure there exceeds the reach of punishment directed at a single man, and comes to signify the contraction of an entire social order. Under those walls, mounted life enters confinement. Personal oath passes into duress, direct contest yields to confinement imposed by masonry, local autonomy meets administrative enclosure, rough justice loses its ground, embodied honor finds itself translated into a language of custody. Even so, the stone achieves only a partial dominion, for the speaking person remains, and speech assumes the character of a last inhabitable ground. Through that transformation, the famous obscenity acquires its full charge, for in the hour when deed can proceed no further, contempt rises into the final exercise of freedom. A generation formed under literary decorum would have grasped the analogy with immediate acuity. When rules draw tightly around the imagination, liberty frequently first announces itself as rupture, whether through a cry, through an oath, or through the refusal of a sentence already prepared by alien hands. Goethe's early art required exactly such a breach, while measure returned only at a later stage, under terms newly won and secured through formal labor. Götz belongs to that earlier historical necessity, in which rupture functions as the condition that makes any later settlement between passion and discipline possible. Posterity continues to move back toward beginnings that retain living heat. Götz endured through its preservation of a foundational instant in German literary self-assertion, the moment at which a national drama declared that its authority could arise from native history, Shakespearean breadth, emotional intensity, and an energy that broke with decorous restraint. Across later periods, Germany returned to the play through repeated encounters with the problem of freedom constrained by institutional power, personality shaped and hemmed by established structures, and nationhood tested beneath competing modes of authority. For that reason, the youthful drama remained open to admiration, available for appropriation, exposed to misreading, and ready for revival. Goethe himself later looked back on the writing and reception of Dichtung und Wahrheit through the perspective of age upon youthful breakthrough. He knew the work had opened a path. He also knew that his own later development moved elsewhere, entering classicism, seeking form under stricter governance, arriving at a balanced one through labor and discipline. That retrospective stance carries weight. The older Goethe absorbed the younger one into a fuller account of artistic growth. Götz therefore remained as evidence of a necessary violence in artistic formation. An artist often breaks a mold before a form can rise. Reception history repeatedly transformed Götz into emblem. At one moment the play appears as knightly freedom. In another age it stands as German energy. Elsewhere it comes forward as anti-bureaucratic hero. Under a different historical light it serves as noble remnant destroyed by central power. Each emphasis reveals its age. Romantic readers loved the rebellious magnitude. Later national feeling found in the work an ancestral strength. Theatre audiences relished the line that scandalized refinement. Directors across generations found in the play difficult riches, sprawling scenes, volatile character contrasts, a historical texture that invites bold staging. Yet afterlife also sharpens danger. A work centered on force can tempt ideological simplification. Heroic figures invite enlistment. German history, with its recurrent appetite for strong personalities, made Götz especially vulnerable to one-sided celebration. Such use shrinks the drama, The real play preserves contradiction, sustaining admiration together with mourning while withholding any clean program. A comparison with Heinrich von Kleist proves illuminating here. In Mihail Kohler's, later German literature returns to the collision of personal justice with legal order, moral absolutism with institutional failure, and singular will with the polity. Kohler's too compels admiration and fear. He begins in grievance, advances through righteous energy, and ends amid devastation. Kleist pushes the problem of force harder and darker than Goethe. The line from Götz to Kohler's passes through German fascination with the terrible dignity of the man who will not yield. One could also invoke Die Hermannsschlacht, where historical violence and national intensity acquire fevered dramatic concentration. Kleist's world feels more fractured, more haunted, more radical in its political ferocity. Yet the afterlife of Götz lives there as well, force tied to historical memory, theatrical collision tied to national self-imagining, freedom pursued through perilous exaltation. That posterity kept returning to Götz also reveals something about Goethe's stature. Later generations looked back at the work and saw the young giant at the instant of breakthrough, prior to Weimar poise, classical discipline, and Olympian authority. They encountered hunger, anger, and a writer in combat with inherited limits. Such moments fascinate readers because they reveal genius in a state of formative strain before it has stabilized itself. The gauntlet shines there again, where the young Goethe required armor in order to strike free of his own preparation. A theatre historical point also enters here. The play, through its breadth and mobility, posed practical challenges that guaranteed ongoing acts of reinvention. Its rapid movement demanded a persuasive staging logic, its crowded sequence of locations required unusual theatrical management, and its rough energy called for a form capable of carrying vitality together with control. Each production answers that demand anew. A work of this kind remains alive by compelling interpretation through performance itself as well as through commentary. One further reason for return lies in the enduring modernity of the central conflict. Bureaucratic orders continue to absorb local life. Institutions demand legibility from personalities who experience themselves as larger than sanctioned roles, and individuals seek freedom through acts of self-assertion that test the terms imposed upon them. Modern readers may stand far from knightly politics, yet they recognize the strain between singular will and administrative structure. Götz rides through changed centuries with that recognizability strapped to his arm. What does the gauntlet mean now? At first it appeared as armor. By now it has become the emblem of a literary generation striking against inherited restraint. Yet the journey altered the object. The gauntlet does not signify simple victory. Iron carried a harsher meaning from the outset. It marks compensation after wound. From it comes gathered might turned against enclosure. Through it the self stands refitted for battle by history's damage. Under that sign, the young Goethe arms his hand against decorum, resists imported regularity, rejects bloodless correctness, and confronts forms polished too finely to bear the shock of lived contradiction. In Götz the iron hand joins horse and storm. The horse gives movement. Through the storm the scene receives atmosphere. That armored emblem gives the act of striking form. Around those three presences the young Goethe built one of the decisive acts of literary rebellion in German letters. Zum's Shakespeare's tag provided the manifesto. In Werther the insurgent soul found its form. With Götz the dramatic body entered the sequence. Through that triad Goethe announced that inherited restraint would yield to a language of force. Freedom born through fracture carries the wound within it, and the gauntlet teaches precisely that. The protagonist resists, he inspires. He also belongs to a vanishing order whose virtues and violences arrive fused. Goethe needed that fusion. He needed gathered might in order to break decorum, for decorum had ceased to trust life. Fracture also became necessary, for inherited smoothness could never admit the true weight of history, feeling, personality, or rebellion. The gauntlet became necessary, for an unguarded hand would have slipped upon so hard a surface. Young Goethe therefore turned to iron, horse, oath, insult, prison, betrayal, and storm, seeking in that harsh cluster a medium strong enough to carry living fire. From Shakespeare he took permission for that turn. Out of a German past rough enough to bear such heat, he drew the substance he needed. Literary manners that could speak gracefully about passion while keeping passion under lock fell away before that movement. In that turning he made a drama whose very imperfections remain evidence of necessity, as Götz rides fast, strikes hard, breaks form, and falls, and through that fall German literature stood up in another shape. So the Gauntlet knows freedom after all, and it knows that freedom often enters art as a blow.